Welcome to our reading and celebration of Nicole Chung's latest book, All You Can Ever Know, a memoir that explores family, identity, and transracial adoption. Jin Lee writes, a primary document of witness, Chung writes her memoir as a transracial adoptee with honesty, wisdom, and love. Her search and what she discovers offers us life's meaning and purpose of the very highest order. Nicole's essays and articles have been published in the New York Times, GQ, Shondaland, ELLE, Longreads, Buzzfeed, Vulture, and Hazlitt. She's the editor-in-chief of Catapult magazine and the former managing editor of The Toast. And for those of you who have not heard yet, Nicole's been doing like a huge press, rounds in the press. And this morning I heard Nicole on Code Switch, and tomorrow she will be on The Daily Show at 11 p.m. So tune in for that. Later in the program, Nicole will be joined by Greg Pak. Greg is a filmmaker and comic book writer, best known for his award-winning feature film, Robot Stories, his blockbuster comic book series like Planet Hulk and World War Hulk, and his record-breaking Kickstarter publishing projects with Jonathan Coltoun, Code Monkey Save World, and The Princess Who Saved Herself. And you might see some postcards around this space at our book table as well for The Princess Who Saved Her Friends. Greg has a Kickstarter going for that project, so be sure to check it out and to back the project if you'd like. We'd like to thank a few people before we move forward. First of all, this program is co-sponsored by Also Known As and the Korean American Adoptee Adoptive Family Network. We'd like to thank Catapult for collaborating with us, especially Katie Boland, Jennifer Kovitz, and Julie Bunton, and also AAWW interns and volunteers and staff who keep these events going. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Nicole Chung.
Thank you all so much for being here. Oh, okay, that's better. Thank you for being here. I've wanted to read here at AAWW for a long time, and it means a lot. And thank you so much to my adoption and adoptee family members who could be here tonight. I'm just really excited and honored by your presence. I'm reading a bit from one of the early chapters of my book. It's one of my favorite chapters. It's more focused on my adoptive parents and the story of my adoption. My parents' story together began in the spring of 1973, when they married and struck out west. She was 21, he was 22, and they'd been dating a matter of months when she told him she was leaving Cleveland, a city she'd never much liked, for Seattle, where she'd always planned to live, and where her own mother had spent the war years, living with her aunt and uncle, the Swedish fishermen. My mother hadn't inherited much from her mother, save her red hair, quick temper, and stubborn attachment to the green beauty of Washington State. So different from the smoke and cement of Cleveland. She'd been to Seattle, carted along on cross-country road trips in the family station wagon to visit her great-aunt and great-uncle. She'd never forgotten the pine-scented air or the snow-tipped mountains wreathed in clouds, the hilly city lapped at its edges by a cold saltwater sound. Now she'd gotten into nursing school out there, so was he coming with her or not? Their families charged them with desertion, but the move had its appeal. They were each one of 5 siblings, high in the birth order, and in different but defining ways their parents had been hard on them. They did move out west, but not to Seattle, not yet. A printing company offered him a job in Ketchikan, Alaska. She found a job in the local hospital. They rented a basement apartment in a cottage on the edge of the Inside Passage, where they could step outside and watch eagles wheeling over the ruffled water. For a pair of born and bred Clevelanders, Ketchikan was almost too quaint to be believed. With its fishermen and modest tourist trade, its streets and wooden pilings slick with rain 140 days out of the year. It wasn't quite the change she'd envisioned, but a chance it still was to escape and try on a different life. They felt like pioneers. But when the transfer to Seattle came a few years later, they were ready to live in a city again. One Sunday on a whim, they visited a little white steepled church set into the hills above the neighborhood, where they rented an attic apartment. The priest's gentle Polish accent reminded her of her beloved grandfather. But it was someone else at the parish who grabbed their attention, a short, stout nun with blunt bangs peeking out from under a wimple. They told Sister Mary Frances they had little interest in organized religion, let alone the church in which they'd both been raised, but she somehow convinced them to return. They were back in the fold with barely a token argument raised in their own defense. This time, though, they were changed. They believed it all. They asked God to move in their lives. They saw his hand at work, in friends met and in jobs found and day-to-day life, where they'd never looked for him before. It was through their parish they met Liz, a woman of faith, another smile in a sea of faces, but no one they thought would change their lives. Years later, in the summer of 1981, after they'd moved to Southern Oregon, after a decade of marriage, half of it spent looking for children that never came. After they'd finally started looking into adoption as a last resort, Liz was the one who called to tell them about a premature baby at the Seattle Children's Hospital, a girl who'd beaten the odds, a girl who needed a family. They'd always planned to have children, though they hadn't been in a hurry, but she got pregnant only once and had been carrying a matter of weeks when they found out the fetus had no heartbeat. They were told that couples facing infertility should grieve the loss of biological children before they move forward with adoption. But for them, spending years or even months in mourning didn't feel right. The miscarriage had been devastating, but they'd already resigned themselves to the fact that biological children might not be in their future. They both just wanted a baby. If they were lucky enough to be able to adopt, they said, they would never dwell on things they'd been denied. So when Liz called to tell them about the baby, it felt as if God was finally smiling down on them. And when she added the baby was Korean, it didn't temper their enthusiasm. They might have to warn their families, but they'd been hoping and praying for a child to adopt. And what was this call if not the Lord choosing to answer their prayers? What did the child's race matter in the end when they had so much love to give? They thought it would be unseemly to focus on a thing like that in the face of such a gift. It wouldn't have mattered to us if you were black, white, or purple with polka dots, they'd tell their daughter over and over, once she was old enough to understand the story of how she came to them. Odd as that declaration would sound to me every time, I would always believe them. Now that they had a real child in their sights, they wanted to move quickly. So they didn't ask many questions about their would-be daughter's family. They didn't want to meet the couple or learn their names. Even talking about them felt like a risk. Their family-to-be, the one they could finally see in their minds, was still little more than a wish. The all-too-fragile arrangement might fall apart if they pushed too hard in any one place. So there was never any discussion about the birth family's social history, nor was there any discussion about a more open adoption, which would have been uncommon at the time. Surely what any child of any color needed, they thought, was stability. The birth parents didn't have their own legal representation. Perhaps they couldn't afford it, or perhaps they thought it unnecessary. The adoptive parents' lawyer talked with them a couple of times just to pass along the parents' wishes and make sure the paperwork was in order. All parties agreed to a closed adoption, with no information exchanged, no contact planned. Boilerplate, the lawyer would call it. When they told their families of their plans, no one tried to talk them out of adopting a Korean baby. Everyone knew how much they wanted to be parents. Many years later, the parents and grandmother would laugh over how one of the girl's cousins managed to reach the age of 12 without realizing she wasn't born into their family. As far as most of them were concerned, the adoption might as well have leached the melanin from the child's skin and hair, rounded the corners of her eyes, erased her family tree entirely. Those papers made her one of them, no matter where or whom she'd come from. 3 weeks after learning about the child, they drove up to Seattle. They sat through an interview with a King County social worker. If the birth parents ever try to challenge the adoption or regain custody, I'll speak for you, the social worker said. I told them they didn't have to do this. The social worker, the birth parents had asked if the new parents could cover some of the girl's medical bills. The portion amounted to less than $3,000. Compared to most adoptions at the time, it was a bargain. Eventually, the adoptive mother asked about the child's race. Was there anything they should know since she was Korean? Was there anything special they should do? The social worker seemed surprised by the question. She looked at them for a moment and then shook her head. I'm sure you'll all be fine. No matter how a child joins your family, their presence changes all the rules. They move into your heart and build new rooms, knock down walls you never knew existed. This is why new parents crave reassurance more than anything else. We tell ourselves that we're going to be wonderful parents, that our children will be happy, that their suffering will be light, or at least not of a kind we cannot help them through. We have to believe these things, promise ourselves we'll meet every challenge, or we'd never be brave enough to begin. So many times I've tried to imagine that winter day in the King County Courthouse, the day my adoption was finalized. I picture some middle-aged, balding judge peering down from the bench at my father, still dark-haired, with no traces of gray, looking serious for once in his life. My mother, with her creamy, freckled skin and nervous smile, cradling me in a pink blanket. Like many new parents, they hoped to do the best they could and expected that would always be sufficient. I'm told the judge spoke very seriously with them about the decision, the commitment they'd made. There was no changing their minds. They were my real parents, my only parents under the law. Thrilled to affix an official state seal to what they already knew in their hearts, my parents asked the judge if he had any advice. I wonder if he was surprised by their question, as the social worker had been, or if it was one he expected, one he'd even heard countless times from white parents of non-white children. Did he perhaps respond without thinking, informed by years of experience? Did he offer all such families the same advice? Or did he look closely at my young, eager parents and consider them specifically before answering? Just assimilate her into your family, he said, and everything will be fine. She's yours now. She's yours. These were the words my parents had hoped to hear ever since they made the decision to have a child. They thanked the judge, smiling as they accepted his congratulations. Then they bundled me up against the January chill, walked out of the courthouse, and brought me home.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nicole. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you again to the Asian American Writers Workshop. I wanted to just say two quick things about that. This was the first place that I did a screenplay reading of my movie Robot Stories. A million years ago, so I owe a lot. And also, this was this was one of the first places that ever published my cartoons, way back in 1990 something. So thank you again to the workshop. This place is constantly doing events like this and bringing in awesome people. And so if you all are here for the first time, come on back a second and third and fourth time. Nicole, when I've told you this before, when I read your book for the first time, you sent me a reader's copy, and I read it, and I cried and cried and cried and cried. I read. I think I read it in like 2 sittings, and I mean, like 6 or 7 times I just teared up. On the today on the subway, I was going through the book again to kind of prepare for today, and of course I'm like crying on the subway.
Oh man, I'm sorry.
Crying on the subway. It's all right. It's all right. Lots of people cry on the subway.
It's very normal thing to do.
But it's just such an affecting book. And just to kind of start us off, I was curious because you're digging into not only your own, in order to dig into your own past, you're digging into the past of basically everybody important in your life. You know what I mean? There's like a cast of, a dozen people whose, most intimate moments are described in the book. And I was curious how you went about that, because it's one thing to kind of bare your own soul, but in a way you're bearing the souls of other people too. And what's that process like, and how did that work?
There's that like famous quote, I think it's Milos, who said, if a writer is born into the family's finished, which is, I mean, it's so interesting. I think about that all the time. Someone else said a writer's always betraying someone. I really tried not to do that with this book. I think there are a lot of ways to go about writing a memoir, and I don't mean to judge any of them, but my intention was definitely not to either air every family secret or to burn all my bridges. So I remember it was really important to me, like from the beginning, to sort of, it wasn't really a collaborative process in the sense that they wrote with me, but I felt like my family members were very much informed and with me and not surprised by either the stories I was relaying or, you know, what did end up in the book. I know most people won't have read it. There's a lot in the book, particularly about my biological sister, Cindy, and she actually gets her own storyline within the book and chapters from her perspective throughout. I knew she was going to be so important to the story that I wanted to tell. I really think of it as our story, not just mine. So especially for those chapters and for the parts that really focus on her experience and things that happened to her that were very difficult and traumatic. Again, it was just a matter of like clear communication. I did send her multiple chapters and multiple drafts, and it was the sort of thing where if she'd wanted me to take anything out, I absolutely would have. I think she was glad I was telling the story, but I did ask her like in a pretty annoying way, like repeatedly, because I didn't want to assume just because she told me yes once that the answer was always yes either. So with every new thing that I wrote about regarding her life, I would kind of check in again. And I sent early copies of the book to like my adoptive parents and my birth father as well, just so there weren't like shocks or surprises. But I obviously couldn't have told this story with just my life. I mean, it is my memories and largely my experiences, especially the first part of the book about growing up adopted. You know, those are mine. But yeah, there were definitely a lot of things I went into that I wanted to make sure that my family wasn't surprised by.
Did you have any moments where you really wanted to put something in, but it felt like you shouldn't for, you know, kind of responsibility to family or a ethical or moral sense that like this would be unfair to somebody?
That's a good question. I mean, the parts that were, I think, the hardest to write about publicly were about what happened to my biological sister, who was abused for many years. And I really wanted to make sure it was very much okay with her. So I checked in a lot, essentially. And that was the part that I could have left out if she wanted me to. It's pretty essential to the story and also relates to my adoption. So that was why it's in there. But again, it was really a question of, you know, is she really okay with me telling the story? Can I tell it in a way that feels like it is honoring her and what she went through? So yeah, but that was probably the hardest part.
Now that the book's been out for a while, has everybody had a chance to read it and have what kind of responses have you gotten from family members?
Oh, they read it like way before it came out. Most of them read it like a year ago. As soon as I had a finished draft, we sent it out. So yeah, they read that and they liked it. They have all also gotten final copies, so they could see like how it changed a little bit. So yeah, I think the response has been really positive. So I feel very supported and really lucky in that sense.
I'm trying to figure out how much we should talk about the content of it. How many people have actually read the book so far? Okay, handful. All right. I'm going to try not to go whole spoiler hog here, or whole hog spoilers here, because the book is kind of a mystery. I mean, that's one of the things that I loved about it, was that I wasn't expecting, you know, when I was like, awesome, this is going to be this great memoir. I didn't expect that it would actually, you know, that I'd kind of be on the edge of my seat, kind of waiting to find out what's going to happen next. So I won't spoil it too much, but you mentioned your sister, and there is this kind of surprising way in which you kind of realize that your sister is really, I mean, that relationship that's the primary emotional focus in the book as it pans out. When you were writing the book, did you did you know the story when you started writing, or was the story unfolding as you were writing?
Oh, so I did know the whole story. So most of the events in the book take place, like I searched for my birth family now, it's been over 10 years ago. So that part, I sort of, in a sense, I knew how it was going to end. I wasn't completely sure how to end the book. Like that's a whole separate question. It's hard knowing where to end a memoir and how, because your life's ongoing and these relationships are ongoing. I mean, if I were to write this book 10 years from now, it might look very different than it looks today because of who I am now as I'm writing it and where those relationships are. But yeah, I think that I knew the events. All the same, like certain storylines did emerge in the writing. I knew my sister would be a major character in a lot of ways. She's kind of a hero of the story. You know, in a lot of ways, it's a love story between sisters, honestly, like where you see us growing up on parallel tracks and sort of, we're headed for collision, but you're not quite sure when or where or how. And I love that. I like that part. And I wanted to capture the feel of mystery that she had too, because she grew up in complete ignorance of me. She didn't know about the adoption. She didn't know like that I was out there. And so as surprising as it was for me, like all the things I learned when I reunited with my birth family, like she was working with a lot less information than I had. So from her standpoint, it really was even more of a mystery. And her storyline was always going to be there, but I think how central it became, how she ended up having not just one or two, but multiple chapters that were just focused on her and her perspective and her memories based on like my interviews with her. That was a surprise. I think she definitely emerged more in the telling than I had expected.
I mean, structurally, I love it because you cross-cut between yourself, on your own journey, searching, trying to figure things out, and then you cut to your sister. Then there's a chapter of your sister who's in her own space, and there's no reference to you there. I mean, you're just kind of describing what she's doing, and you realize she's on her own parallel path. And as a reader, you're waiting for those two stories to intersect. It's just great tension. How did that structure come about? Like,
I had this dream. I'd written like the full manuscript, and it wasn't, I didn't hate it. It wasn't bad. And I sent it to my editor, and she was actually editing it. I'm sorry, Julie. She was like mid-edit, and I had this weird dream one night. I dreamt I was talking to Julie. It's like always great when your subconscious sends you book dreams. It's a sign of like a really healthy process. good work-life balance. But anyway, I had this dream where I was telling her, I need to restructure the whole book. I need to like take it apart, and like we need to get to the question of the search, if I'll do it, how it happens a lot sooner. And I need to bring this story with my sister forward, and I need to cut between all three of these different stories. And she was like, okay, just don't delete what you have, please. So I did. I spent a couple of weeks just kind of tearing it apart based on this very vivid dream I had. It ended up working really even better than I thought it would. It ended up moving a lot faster. I think bringing my sister's story forward, cutting back and forth between key childhood, adoption, upbringing moments, and the search helps build the tension. It helps move it along faster. And yeah, it was a fascinating process sitting here with like whole chapters and figuring out what order they should go in, just to like, again, like heighten that tension and make the structure work. I think structure is the hardest part in a lot of ways of writing a story in particular. Like your narrative arc, structure's the hardest thing. So figuring that out felt good and also kind of scary because I was scrapping what I'd already had.
Did you end up having to throw away a lot of stuff or just rearrange it?
I did. I cut about 10,000 words, but then I added 5,000 new ones. So, in the end, it wasn't a huge net loss. But yeah, I did cut a lot.
So what did you eat and drink before you had that dream? Because I think I need to try that because that was a very effective dream.
Like coffee and adrenaline is pretty much like what I was running on that whole year.
All right, because I don't drink coffee, so maybe I need to start.
How do you live?
I just good, clean living.
Oh my God.
Panic. That's all I need. Just a little deadline panic. Okay. I'm good to go. Actually, to be honest, I can't. I used to stay up all night to get my stuff done. I can't do it anymore. I do drink tea. But I can't drink coffee. I'm not sad. Weird. I like coffee ice cream. Although I'm becoming lactose intolerant in my old age, so that's sad.
I just carry Lactaid Fast-Act caplets around with me everywhere.
Good tips.
I recommend.
Tips from smart writers here. People, write this down. Yep. So you mentioned interviews. So did you do like formal interviews as well while you were preparing for the book?
I mean, a lot of us have like that family lore that we've inherited, right? Like there are stories you've heard about yourself or your childhood, even things that you don't think are true, but you've heard them so many times you like accept them and could recite them yourself. So I had a lot of those types of stories from childhood that, I mean, I did double check certain things, but like that chapter I read from tonight about my parents and how they adopted me, like I must have heard that so many times. It was really a matter of like fact check, what year, that sort of thing. I did do some other interviews. I was able to talk to the attorney who handled my adoption, not recently, but I talked with her a few years ago and I still had those notes. So I did use those. There are several things where I I wouldn't call it a formal sit-down interview, but I did talk to my sister again and took like copious notes while she told me more about her childhood and more about her teen years. I realized there are parts of her life where I knew some details, but I really needed it filled in a lot to write about it. And then I talked to my adoptive parents again several times just to get, not just a fact check, but to see if there were things I was missing, things that they felt were important or specific memories they might have had about like our adoption discussions or race discussions or lack thereof. So yeah, I wouldn't call it like formal interviews like the way I interview sources, but certainly like interviews where I took a lot of notes and wrote from those.
Were there any, so when you started out to write, you knew the story, but was there anything that you discovered along the way? Any surprises that came up along the way while you were writing and researching?
I was writing. It wasn't exactly a shock, but I did just learn like the power of writing a story that you think you know and you understand inside and out, and then you kind of realize like there's still a lot that you're processing and dealing with. Most of the events in this book took place years ago, and I really would have thought like I've dealt with this. Like this is like I've made space for this in my life and I've incorporated it into who I am, and now I've moved forward with it, carrying it. And I realized like the way something feels when you're carrying it, legacy or trauma or history or loss, it changes as you revisit it. It changes as you write about it. It changes as you talk to other people about it. Doing all these talks about the book have been it's been a little emotionally draining. Talking with my children at times about the story has been, not hard. I'm glad to be able to do it. It feels like a privilege to be able to share this history with them because I didn't have it growing up and I know how precious it is. But it's definitely like challenging revisiting and then figuring out how to help them make space for it in their lives. It's been interesting.
There's I don't know if this is junk science or not, but I remember reading some talk about memory a while back with the notion that like the more you remember something, the more like you kind of re-imprint it in your brain cells and run the risk of kind of recreating that memory in different ways. Have you had that kind of, is it a weird thing like writing about something so intensely personal and then talking about it so much? Do you have to like protect the actual memory of it somehow, or?
I'm really glad I wrote about a lot of it because, in a way, I guess I could have kept a lot of this locked away or kept it to just me or my family or something. But I really love, in a way, that this book does represent not just my family and who we were and who we are, but like who we are at this very particular point. And I wrote this book, and then my adoptive father passed away while I was writing it. And it's been like hard, but also kind of special to know that like he's memorialized in a way in the pages, which is obviously not something I could have foreseen when I started writing it. But yeah, the way I think about him and our relationship and how much, how he thought about me and how much he loved me, like these things are in these pages forever, that has meant a lot. So I don't know. I think I'm especially happy, grateful because of that loss that I do have this book, that I can share it with my kids, that they will see, they will learn a lot from it, hopefully, but they will also have this like living memory of their grandfather. That to me is really meaningful.
You've already been doing a lot of events, all right? There's your 4. Okay, cool. But the book's been out for a while too, and you're getting emails and stuff from people, I imagine. What's the reaction been like, and what's it feel like to have it out in the world? How have people been responding?
I feel like I hit maximum feelings every day by like 10 a.m. and then like I have nothing else in the bank, and then I kind of just store it up and I'm like, I will feel this later. I take a lot of screenshots of things because I'm like, I can't really like engage with this right now, but I know someday I'll want to look back and remember like this particular thing someone said, because it's lovely. Like I just can't stress how I love that moment when you like share a story and you're not alone with it anymore. Like you've brought people in. I just find so much meaning and purpose in that, and I want to like remember and treasure these first moments where it's out there, it's its own thing, and I get to share it with people. Like that's amazing. It's a gift, and at the same time, like it's so much. I don't get a chance to feel or process it all, so kind of storing it up. I think it's hard to pick a best part, but I hear from several adoptees like every day. I have since the a couple of excerpts ran online, and those were like when I started to hear from adoptees. I mean, I've heard from fellow adoptees throughout my career. When I've written about this, I usually get some feedback, and it's been wonderful to connect. But since the book, it's been like 5 to 10 a day, and it's been extraordinary and meaningful. Like the youngest adoptee to write to me so far has been 15, and the oldest has been in their 70s. And a lot of Korean adoptees, but a lot of other races and backgrounds and countries represented. And it's been incredible to get to share that with so many of my adoptee, my adoption family, I guess. It's great. It's made me feel like that's one of the reasons I wrote it. Not the only reason, but a really important one, to have this kind of underrepresented perspective out there. And I hope it's one of many, many more that we'll see.
Right. What kind of advice would you have for somebody who is working on their own memoir after having gone through all of this?
I always feel like I'm the worst person to give advice about writing, because the way I do it is so crammed in the margins of I have a full-time job, I freelance, I've got 2 kids. It's just I don't have a process. I realized this. Alex Chi asked me this last night, do you have a process? And I was like, oh God, I don't have a process. I don't have a favorite time of day, and I don't have a favorite chair, and I don't have a favorite playlist or anything. I pretty much just do it because I feel like I have to. Maybe the best advice is, if you really feel like your story is when you have to tell, listen to that urge, listen to that voice. I know with this book, there were many years where I thought it would never be published. There were many years where I thought, no one's going to want to publish this. There aren't a lot of adoptee narratives out there. How is it even going to find a home? I also felt like if I didn't at least try to write this book, it would always just be there, tapping me on the shoulder forever, and I would never get any peace. So, I think you just have to write whatever feels most pressing and important to you. And I don't know, treasure the experience as much as you can, and remember that what you have to say is important. We need your voice. We need more voices.
We're going to turn it over to audience questions in just a second, but let me squeeze one more in here. What's the biggest surprise or difference between the book you envisioned when you started and the book you ended up with?
I think, like I said, I don't mean to go back to structure because I feel like it might bore people. I was not expecting it to...
This is the writer's workshop. They want to hear.
I wasn't expecting it to not just move back and forth in time, but cut back and forth between me and my biological family quite as much as it did. I would have thought I didn't have enough material, honestly, about them at the beginning. But it turned out I did. And it was really wonderful getting to share that. I feel like there's a lot of focus in adoption narratives on the adopted parents, on the adopted child, who always stays a child and never grows up. But there isn't a lot out there actually about birth families, about their realities and the circumstances that might lead them to make a decision like that. And so I think I feel it's a great privilege that I got to explore that in the book, and I'm really glad it kind of came to the forefront and became such an important part of the book.
That's great. All right, let's go to the audience. Is there? There's a hand in the back there.
Hi. Yeah, we have a question from the live stream. Nicole, what advice do you have for an Asian American poet from Idaho coming to Minnesota for an MFA program using creative writing to find culture, self-identity, and language in a more diverse community?
First of all, good for you. Secondly, I'm in awe of poets. I don't know how y'all do it, because I overwrite everything, and I just can't imagine just the economy of language alone. I think it's really wonderful that that's what you're doing, that you're pursuing a dream, and not just a creative dream, but in a place that you feel, I'm assuming you feel will be more like home, maybe than where you came from. I've been really lucky to find, not just through seeking it out, communities have found me. I feel really lucky for that. Online spaces have been huge. Places like Kundiman and Hyphen before the Toast even Twitter, as horrible as it can be, has been a really important community for me, at least a lot of people there, including Greg. So I just think the most important thing, we don't talk, I think, enough about how art takes work and art takes a community. And I don't mean that as trite lip service. I don't think anything I do would be possible without the communities I've come from and the people who've helped me. So seek out the people who believe in you and your art and your vision and your voice. You start with one, and then you'll find another and another. I just think that's really important, is to try and seek out that support, because you need it and you deserve it. We should all have it.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask about that, because I've noticed, like, on your tour, like, I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces pop up. You know, like you had Alexander Chi, and didn't Celeste do it, or she's going to do it?
I'm going to be with Celeste in Boston.
Right. So you want to talk a little bit more about that, about this, like, community? Because it seems like you got a lot of Asian American writers in your corner.
It's true. I feel really, really lucky in that sense. And also, everywhere I go, I kind of meet either toasties or great Asian American writers. And I've met I've met people that I knew on LiveJournal 10 years ago. So it's been an interesting tour. I feel really loved and supported. So, I think as hard as online spaces can be, and as hard as it can be when they change, right? Because I think those communities can shift a lot. They can be really nurturing spaces if you're fortunate, and I feel like I've been very fortunate.
Any other questions? There we go. Don't be shy. Throw up a hand. Where's a hand? Anybody? Yes, right there.
How did your parents deal with, like, telling you that you were adopted, or, like, did you just wake up one day and find out that you look different, or did they, like, kind of celebrate that in a way?
I do not remember at all the first conversation. It must have been, like, as soon as I was verbal. I mean, I don't remember a time when I didn't know I was adopted. The way we talked about it was always like this familiar story. You know, your birth parents came here from Korea, and they wanted to keep you maybe, but they didn't feel they could. They didn't feel like they had the resources or whatever. It was pretty basic, like a lot of guesses, but that was what I was told. In terms of, like, the fact that I was different, we noticed, people noticed. It wasn't something we talked about a lot as a family. So, I don't remember a lot of conversations about, like, the transracial aspect in particular, except I do remember them saying it doesn't matter to us, right? Which I think is largely what I think it didn't matter to them in terms of their love for me. And I think they were also told by, like, experts that it shouldn't matter to them. But obviously it mattered a lot to me, and it mattered to others. So, we didn't really talk much about it, though, growing up.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of follow up on that a little bit. I mean, your love for your parents is so clear throughout the whole book, and their love for you is so clear. At the same time, it's also clear you've got kind of ambiguous feelings about the kind of colorblindness sort of attitude that they brought you up with. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I don't even know that it was ambiguous. Like, I think there was a lot of, like, unintentional, like, well-intentioned harm in that, because we didn't talk about race at all, because I wasn't really brought up to know what racism was beyond something in the past that's usually violent that we've overcome. Yay. I didn't have the language at all to talk about things that were happening to me. I don't just mean, like, microaggressions. I mean, like, actual blatant racism and slurs and, like, gestures and, like, cruelty. I didn't know what to call that, and I didn't know how to talk about it with anybody. So that was pretty isolating. And I think in a family where we'd been able to talk about race and racism, at all, I think I would have felt a little bit more supported. So, yeah, it was I understand why they were told this, and I understand it was representative of a lot of transracial adoptions at the time, and I don't think it was a great thing, that attitude.
Have you seen your mom's attitudes about that shift over the years, or as you've gotten older?
Yeah, a little bit, just by nature of the fact that, like, I'm older and grown up and can be annoying, and can tell them just, like, what I think now in a clearer way, and I have the language now to say, this was racism, or this was messed up, like, this shouldn't have happened, we should have talked about it. Like, we've had more of those conversations. It's not like I gave them this book and said, here, like, like, you can see all the things that, like, happened and how I think things should have been different. I mean, we've talked about this in real life, like, long before I wrote the book. And I've seen, like, some shifting for sure. Like, I think they have listened, and they understood that even if my race didn't matter to other people, even if it didn't matter to them, it obviously mattered to me. So we have had those discussions. I will say, like, my family and I were very far apart politically. It's still kind of a struggle having a lot of these conversations, but I try. Feels like kind of my job right now to try.
Well, the way you describe yourself in the book, it sounds like you've been that person since you were like 3 when you there's a very funny scene in the book where she's being tested by some psychologist or something like that, and do you want to talk about that at all?
Just real quick, I was born really prematurely, so my mother had me participate in this study of like prematurely born kids when I was 2 or 3, to see if they were doing a study. Okay, so my dad took me, not my mom, which turned out to be a mistake because I answered every question wrong, like on purpose. And my mother asked me later, like, why did you do that? And I said, well, I just didn't like the questions. They were talking to me like I was stupid. And so, I mean, I completely messed up their data set or whatever. It was, my father thought it was hysterical. And like still laughs, he would still laugh about it when he told the story. My mother has never found it funny.
Yeah, right there.
I know for many adoptees, that's to talk about, and having a birth search can be a very complicated issue to talk about with them. Did you find going through that process with them, was that a bonding experience, or did you have any moments where it really became kind of a difficult discussion with them in terms of meeting your birth parents, doing the search? For me, that was, and I mentioned to you that for me that was one of the parts that really resonated with me was I felt like this was the first book that I could give to my parents, say like, hey, I understand there's a lot of complications around doing a birth search, and this book kind of really gets into that.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. It's a good question. I mean, I remember we didn't have just one conversation about my decision to search. We had several. And at first I sort of wimped out and told them, oh, I'm searching, but I really want this medical history, which is true. I wanted the medical history. I was pregnant. It was a big reason I was searching. But I couldn't, in our first conversation, I remember thinking like, oh, you should tell them you're also really curious, and if they want to talk to you, you'll talk. And I didn't say it at that point. It took a couple more conversations. I'd like work my way up to it. I think, as I recall, they took it pretty well. I was older. They didn't feel, I think if I'd been younger, it would have been harder. But I'd already been out of the house for many years, and I was starting a family of my own. They were already not my only family anymore. I think they'd already had to come to terms with that, right? And I do remember my adoptive mom saying to me something, I mean, I'll never forget. She said, like, don't forget who your real family is. Like, she kind of just couldn't resist getting that little, as if I was going to, like, how could I possibly forget who my family was? We have all that history and all those shared memories, but she still really felt like she had to say that just to make sure I understood. But I think especially because in my case, reunion led to a very close relationship with a birth sibling, as opposed to super close relationships with birth parents. I'm sure that also made it easier for them in a sense. Like, a sister's not going to compete, for parental love in the same way. But more than that, I think their ideas about adoption have expanded a little bit, and the idea of what a family can be and how many parents a child can have, how many parents a child can love. I think that has changed. I think they feel less concerned about that. I think they feel pretty secure in like the relationship and the love that we do have. So again, like, maybe they were able to envision a more open adoption, like, that they couldn't have envisioned at the time of placement.
Yeah. Right there.
I'm a Korean adoptee too, and I'm just starting my birth family search, and I just wondered if you had any advice to help smooth that process out.
Good luck. It's so much. It's obviously different for everybody, so please take this with a grain of salt. I mean, one thing I've said to other people who've asked similar questions is, I wish that I had brought people into the search a little bit sooner. I think it would have been hard for me for lots of reasons to say, look to my adoptive parents as my main source of support for during that time. But like, I remember even having a hard time explaining to like the people close, like my husband or my best friends. Like, it was, I remember I would not tell my coworkers. Like, it just seemed like too much. Even coworkers I was close to, I don't know. I didn't want people's questions. I thought I didn't want to have to explain it over and over and over. But looking back, I wish I'd brought a few more people in, like had a closer, more trusted circle at the beginning, because search is so complicated and it's so emotional, and it brings up things that you don't expect. And I think most people going through that will need a real support system. I would say too, one thing I should have done and didn't do at the time was search out like an adoption competent therapist. I'm not, I'm not pushing it on anybody, but I wish personally that I had done that. I think it would have been helpful at the time and helpful after, dealing with just issues that came up in reunion. Good luck.
Is that something a therapist will list as a specialty or something that they do, or is that just something you ask?
Some do. Some do. I know that, a lot of very, very good therapists or counselors, they don't always have a background in adoption, so they might not know about all of the issues involved. Of course, you can still benefit from like talking to anybody who's good at their job and a good therapist. But it can be really good to talk with somebody who this is a specialty or at least one of their areas that they're very familiar with. It's encouraging, at least to me, to know they've worked with other families and other people searching.
In the back there.
Oh, thank you. You mentioned that it was a memoir and you didn't know where to exactly end it. Moving forward from this book, what is an ongoing issue or maybe like a story you want to tell in the future? Or is there any, maybe like in the future, another book?
I'd love to write another book. I don't know if I have another adoption book in me. This might be it, which is not to say like there isn't more to say about it. I mean, it's like 220 some pages. I'm sure I could write 500 more. I'm pretty wordy. So I'm sure I could write more, but I think it's interesting. Maybe it just depends what happens. I'm only 10 years into reunion and 10 years into parenting, and there's a lot of life left. I could see it at least being an issue I revisit at some point. Maybe it wouldn't be the sole focus, right, of another book, but that's a good question. I don't have a firm answer. I would like to write more. Do
you want to say anything about what you are working on next?
Not really. No, I mean, I started like 2 novels and like put them down months ago and haven't picked them up again. I think I need to get through this book tour, and I have been saying to everybody, and it's not tongue-in-cheek, it's very sincere. Like there's a lot of stuff I have not dealt with this year from my father passing and then from having the book stuff immediately start. Honestly, I think I need to take some time. But yeah, I love writing. I'll be doing it for a very long time. And I'm also an editor, so I like to publish other writers, and that's always very inspiring. Usually gets me back to my own projects as well.
So while you're on tour, how do you do these events? You go and you talk, and it's this. I mean, you're telling these very emotional stories. What do you do at night? How do you relax? How do you
Last
unwind?
night I didn't sleep. I was just like, I'm just not sleeping. I like events a lot. I get kind of a charge from them, and then it's sort of hard coming down and going to sleep. I don't know. I'm really new at this, so actually, like, I probably need advice from people. Everyone's like, take sheet masks with you on the road. Like, don't go out after. Like, don't drink a lot of coffee. Things like that. I don't know. I'm pretty bad at self-care.
But then you need to have those dreams, so you got to drink the coffee.
That's true. I've been, and I've been trying to work too. Like, my job is ongoing. So like when I had some downtime at the hotel this afternoon and I was answering work emails. I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of I'm enjoying tour. I really am. I think I'm not good at it yet. That's what I'm saying. I'll figure out my rhythm eventually.
Well, you're doing great right here.
Thank you.
Right there.
On this theme of self-care, about how you see the relationship between racism and self-care, particularly as an adoptee. Just because as adoptees, we don't necessarily have like the resources of family or...
Right. Yeah. I'm going to repeat the question because I'm not sure everybody heard it. The question is a great question. The relationship between racism and self-care, especially for adoptees, because we might not have like the support or the understanding of immediate family. It's a really good question. One of the things I do is, at least in terms of like my writing life and the emotional labor that's required to write a book like this, it was never the only thing I was working on. I had other work, other projects, and other things I could turn to when it was just a little bit too much. That said, it was really a joy to work on this book. I truly didn't like really dread it a lot. But yeah, taking breaks sometimes really was important. Revisiting revisiting like trauma or revisiting racism or revisiting just hard things, and then living through it again in writing. I felt sometimes it was important, like if I wrote a particularly difficult chapter, to take a little break for a few days. And then out in the world, just in terms of when we encounter racism or microaggressions or, bigotry in other forms, I think it's such a hard time right now, and has been, since way before the election, right? But it's been like nonstop and horrible since then. I think people have to do what they have to do. If that's stepping back from certain activities or projects, or if it's like leaning into those things because they bring you joy and comfort and give you purpose, it's going to look different for everybody. I have done both those things. After the election, I took like a 3-month break from this manuscript. That was a good time. I was like, I can't write. Nothing matters. But I don't know. I just think being really patient and gentle with yourself. And again, not to harp on this, but I'm like obsessed with community. I think a lot of times community is something you choose and something you make and something that you find and something that finds you. So maybe your family doesn't understand, or maybe they do, but it's not enough. That is when I think your other non-family communities become really important. Finding like-minded people and finding, maybe fellow adoptees, or finding other groups that you just feel really comfortable with and can be yourself, and can find that support. I've been really leaning on friends a lot for the past several years, really. And it's like probably the only thing that's kept me going. So I think that's just one thing.
I think we've got time for one more question. I think I see a hand way in the back there. Yeah.
From your NPR excerpt, I think one paragraph was just talking about the power of family lore and how it takes place. It places that burden on the child, like the power of religion. Paraphrasing, terrible paraphrase. So what are you intentionally now forming a family lore of your own for your children that you're like kind of can almost verbatim be like, all right, this is our new family lore, considering all the ingredients that I have now and the lens that this book has helped me have, or whatever else?
Yeah, that's a good question. My kids, one of them especially, is still young, so a lot of this I haven't really shared with her. With my older one, I've shared a lot more. It's been really wonderful to just have a history to share and have new family members to introduce to them. Well, not even introduce. My kids, since I reunited with my birth family literally the month I gave birth, like my kids have always known them. And like they've always known my sister. She's just their Aunt Cindy, and like they love her. It's been really wonderful to see how they almost take it for granted that these people are in their lives. So talking with them about our history and about our story, I'm able to say like, no, like we had to do a lot of work to kind of put our families back together. And I'm really, really so grateful that we did. And I'm so glad these people are in your life. But, it wasn't always like this. It wasn't necessarily going to be like this. At the same time, like I don't know, I try to avoid defining things too much for my kids. Just like I want them to have the space to question the narrative too. They're going to also have like questions and experiences and things they'll work out with their identity that have something to do with me, but like it can't be something I just hand down to them. I think a lot of parents, we want to do that because we want things to be simple for our kids and we think it'll make it easier, but they make their own way in the world. They have their own identities that are complicated. So I don't presume really to give them like handed down, this is the absolute truth of our family. I'm sure they will have like their own feelings and questions about it someday. And honestly, I relish those. It's exciting when your kids get old enough to like, to ask those questions and go deeper.
How are you going to react when your kids start writing memoirs about you?
God, I don't know, probably not well. For the most part, I'm lucky because she mainly likes to write comics and fantasy stories involving, magic and dragons and demigods and amulets.
The monster in outer space, too,
Oh,
right?
she's so good at them, yeah. I will say I've been reading the book with my 10-year-old. We're more than halfway through, and, she really loves it. And it's not like it's new to her. She knows the story. So, like, she'll say to me, like, that chapter was a total cliffhanger. We have to read one more. And I'll be like, honey, you know exactly what happens in this story. Like, it's your life. It's our life. But it's cute. Like, she's very caught up in it. And at the same time, it's been good. It's reading it in a longer form. She's definitely had more questions. It's not like there were big shocks, but it's led to like follow-ups that I might not have gotten otherwise. So that's been really fun.
I imagine the book is an enormous gift to those kids, and it's an enormous gift to all of us. It's a tremendous book. I mean, you guys are all here because you're already sold, but buy the book. Give it to your friends. It's one of my favorite things that I've read all year. I mean, did you have anything else you wanted to end with before we?
I don't think. Thank you so much for being here and for the conversation.
I'm
it means
thrilled.
a lot to me. I'm
Honored to be
such a fan. So anyway, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.
You guys are all the best. Thank you so much.